Good afternoon, everybody. So that's kind of an interesting question, because the classical perspective around this, of course, is that ocean biology is limited by nutrients, and nutrients haven't changed much. So the invasion of the ocean by anthropogenic carbon dioxide is a purely physical process. So it was something of a surprise, to me at least, when that was raised as one of the top questions. So so it was really great and exciting to be able to kind of like pull together this panel to kind of like debate this important and topical issue in ocean carbon cycle science. So next slide, please. So I'm on the left, you can see, but today joining us, we've got two real experts in the field. So Jamie Shutler from the University of Exeter and Judith Hauck from the Alfred Wegener Institute, who, amongst her many other achievements, leads on the construction of the global carbon budget, the ocean element of that. So it's really great that you could join us, and I'm really very much looking forward to it. So we've got a couple of housekeeping points from the next slide. So you've had the brief introduction. We're going to have two short presentations from Judith and Jamie, and then some questions and answers. And we really hope that you can kind of contribute to this debate. We've got the meeting chats open, so feel free to put your question in there. We're recording this, so if you put a question in the chat, it won't be in the video recording, so your name won't be displayed. I'll moderate the quick Q&A, and the other thing to say is that after the meeting, you get a goodie bag of further material to read, a copy of this recording, and a few other bits and pieces. So the final thing from me is thank you for joining. Welcome to OceanICU, and that's it from me until the two presentations are finished. So Judith, do you want to take over?
Sure, thank you for the introduction. So I'll show my screen. Okay, so yeah, thanks for being here. We will look at the question that was posted in the IOCR report. Will the ocean uptake of anthropogenic carbon dioxide continue as primarily an abiotic process? And it's actually great that we have the opportunity to clarify this here, because I think there's been a lot of confusion about this question and how it was posed. So it's a complicated question. I would actually like to unpack that into different components. The first question would be, is the ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2 largely an abiotic process? The second would be, will the abiotic uptake of anthropogenic CO2 continue in the future? And then what is the role of biology for present-day ocean CO2 uptake? And will that role of biology change in the future? So to start looking at the first one, this is a figure from the IOCR report, and the reference is given there as well. And I would just like to recap that really we tend to look at a very small residual of very large background fluxes going into and out of the ocean all the time. So the black arrows and numbers given here, which are above 50 petagram carbon per year, indicate the natural carbon fluxes into and out of the ocean. And we think there was a small imbalance of about 0.6 petagram carbon per year in pre-industrial times. Now the red numbers are the anthropogenic carbon uptake, and what the figure at the top also shows is that we know the ocean as a total takes up anthropogenic carbon, but actually the total fluxes can go into and out of the ocean in different regions. So it's not that the ocean everywhere takes up carbon, but yes, there are regions of uptake and regions of outgassing. And if we go back to the figure on the left and the red arrows, these are the anthropogenic fluxes, which are thought to be or are defined to be the response to rising atmospheric CO2. And even there, the red arrows go into and out of the ocean with large numbers on top of them. And really what we are looking for, at least from the global carbon budget perspective, is the net anthropogenic CO2 uptake, which is a relatively small residual of very large background fluxes. So it's obviously clear that the natural carbon cycle is driven by many processes, including biology, physics, and chemistry. But the way it's defined really suggests that the anthropogenic CO2 flux is an abiotic response to rising atmospheric CO2. So that's the physical chemical response to the increasing gradient of the partial pressure of CO2 between ocean and atmosphere. That the ocean has no other chance other than taking up CO2 to work towards a chemical equilibrium. So if we look at the global carbon budget figure, which shows that the ocean on average takes up 26% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions from burning of fossil fuels and from land use change, then here we're really talking about an abiotic CO2 uptake, which is also different from the situation on land, just as a side note, where there is really a fully biotic response. So will the abiotic uptake of anthropogenic CO2 continue in the future? And here I would like to show the figure from the IPCC report, which has nicely summarized how the ocean and land carbon sinks will evolve in future emission scenarios, going from low emission scenarios on the left in light blue to a high emission scenario in red on the right-hand side. Well, what this figure maybe misses out is an overshoot scenario or a very low emission scenario. So in that case, actually, the ocean may start to lose carbon at some point. But what we see here is that the ocean uptake certainly will continue into the future, and it will scale essentially with the rise of atmospheric CO2. So the amount of carbon going into the ocean, which is this colored bar, or the colored part of the bar plot, that does increase from low to high emission scenarios. So the total amount of CO2 taken up is larger in high emission scenarios. However, also this gray part of the bar is larger in high emission scenarios, meaning that a larger share of CO2 emissions remains in the atmosphere in high emission scenarios. And these are carbon-carbon and carbon-climate feedbacks that prevent the ocean and land sinks to take up as much carbon as in the low emission scenarios in a relative sense. Okay, so what is the role of biology for present-day ocean CO2 uptake? And here, in fact, I would like to make the point that most of the evidence we have for this really looked at the pre-industrial ocean carbon uptake and not at the present day, because in the transient state, it's going to be different as it was in the pre-industrial steady state And what this figure shows is a very much cited figure from Ernst Mayr-Reimer from 1996, who did model experiments with a dead ocean essentially. So if we look at the difference between the solid line and then the dashed line at the top with the crosses, which would be the dead ocean experiment with no biology acting, then we see a difference of about 200 ppm in atmospheric CO2. So we can conclude from that the biological carbon pump reduces what I would call the background atmospheric CO2 in pre-industrial state, but about 200 ppm. I would argue, and there's work we're doing on that aspect, that probably this is an overestimate by a factor of 2, as it neglects the feedback by the land. And this is work that Andreas Oschlies had shown in 2009 already, and we're working on this as well. So certainly it does have an effect on atmospheric CO2. So will the role of biology for ocean CO2 uptake change in the future? Possible, likely. I mean, we know from paleo evidence that this has happened in the past, so the mechanisms are there, they can act. We just don't have evidence currently that biology has changed in such a way in the past decades that it would have an effect on atmospheric CO2 already. So the possible mechanisms here are a changing chemical state. So in a high CO2 ocean, the buffer capacity of the ocean is reduced, and the same amount of biology could actually lead to a different uptake of carbon. The second mechanism is a changing physical state, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. And the third one is changing biological fluxes, and this is one I'm not going to detail here any further. There's very nice reviews by Stephanie Hansen, for example. So the first one is the changing chemical state. So as I just said, in a high CO2 ocean, the carbonate chemistry is in a different state, and the same biological processes actually can lead to a different air-sea CO2 flux. Now, this, I think, is in principle understood. The carbonate chemistry is well known, but it is quite hard to quantify this. based on the paper by Andrea Fassbender et al., it's likely a second order effect, maybe less than 10%. The second mechanism that can lead to a different role of biology for ocean CO2 uptake is via a changing physical state, so essentially via changes in stratification. And this figure here is from a paper by Ivy Franger, also building on some of the work in Jamie Wilson's paper that essentially shows that even with a decrease in export flux here in the climate change state, as the ocean circulation slows down and the ocean is more stratified, the carbon is kept in the deep ocean for longer, and thus the biological carbon pump could actually be more efficient simply because the physical state has changed. So to wrap up, looking at the first question again, is the ocean uptake of anthropogenic CO2 largely an abiotic process? Yes, absolutely. Will the abiotic uptake of anthropogenic CO2 continue? Yes, at least as long as our emissions lead to an increase in atmospheric CO2. We may come to a very different state after peak emissions or in different emission scenarios. What is the role of biology for present-day ocean CO2 uptake? Well, without biology, atmospheric CO2 would be probably about 100 ppm higher. And will the role of biology for ocean CO2 uptake change in the future? Maybe. Some people may even say possible or likely, but certainly human CO2 emissions will remain the most important driver for the ocean CO2 uptake. And with that, I would pass on to Jamie, I believe, or back to Richard. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Judith. And I think Jamie's just changing to the presenter. Whilst he's doing that, I just urge you to put your questions in the chat because we're hoping to have a nice discussion. We only have 2 talks today, so there's plenty of time for you to interact with the panelists and with each other. And with that, over to you, Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Thanks, Judith, as well for the nice starting to start off. So my title, as you'll notice, is slightly different. So I'm trying to put across my viewpoint in terms of why biology has altered the natural system and how it's done that, but also why I think it can also alter the anthropogenic state, so the current ocean sink. And I have the word help here in brackets because I'm saying that I think either the biology can contribute to the sink, but also it can help enable the uptake of carbon through the chemistry or the physics, which is the processes of which Judith was focusing on. So I wanted to kind of set the theme for this and explain why one piece of evidence as to why I think biology is likely to can help control with the current oceanic sink. So this is clearly Earth on the right here, and Venus we have on the left. So these are about the same size planets, in terms of how large planets can get. They're relatively similar sizes. They're about the same distance from the sun. They contain about the same amount of carbon, but clearly Venus has a runaway climate, roasting temperatures on the surface. And the reason for that is that it doesn't have any water. So on Earth, water and carbon help to regulate our climate. But the other big difference is the atmospheric composition on Earth has a large component of oxygen. And this slug of oxygen is there because of the long-term accumulation of oxygen, thanks to biology. So the growth of early cyanobacteria and the evolution of the Earth has led to a large amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. But the reason why we have only a small amount of carbon dioxide, so it's the trace gas, is because a lot of that carbon has been locked away before it could be decomposed. It's been locked away in the oceans, within the water itself, but also to the sediment. So clearly, the biology has had a strong controller of the natural evolution of our planet and the chemistry in the atmosphere, but also of the carbon cycle. And so you can look at this in terms of 3 grand stabilizing processes within the natural carbon cycle and the evolution of our Earth. The first one is this atmospheric CO2 thermostat. This is predominantly, or it's driven by igneous rocks and weathering, and therefore clearly there's no biological influences within there. But the last 2, the second 2, the oxygen homostat, this is how we've ended up with a large amount of oxygen in our atmosphere. And then the last one, the ability of the oceans to control, to buffer changes in the pH, which means that you can then control the cycling of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean, is clearly also biologically controlled. So over these really long time periods, the natural carbon cycle is clearly strongly influenced by biology. So now we need to think about the contemporary, the current oceanic sink, which, as Judith was saying, is forced by these atmospheric emissions in the atmosphere. So it's changed from the ocean's changed from being a source to a sink. And traditionally, people will consider and generally think about biology as having a small impact. And it's quite clear within this diagram is from the latest global carbon budget, why you would reach that conclusion. So you can see the areas that I've labeled with the arrows are all areas where biology is having an influence, but they're all quite small amounts. Whereas that large disk, you can see the dissolved inorganic component is where the majority of carbon is stored within the oceans. So my viewpoint on this is, how is biology enabling or supporting these large exchanges, both exchanges at the surface, but also the conditions that are set within the ocean, the interior ocean itself? So, how is biology actually helping to support this large amount of dissolved inorganic carbon within the ocean, or is it, therefore, is it contributing that way? So to discuss that point, I'd like to present 3 different pieces of evidence, and these look at different scales and also different approaches. So the first one is this study, which is a machine learning approach, and here they took a whole bunch of CMIP6 models, so model reanalysis model runs, that were used for this latest IPCC report. And here they used a machine learning approach to look across those and identify how they could reliably reconstruct the ASC exchange at the surface based upon the data within the model runs themselves. So it's a large machine learning approach where they're trying to identify what are the key predictors for the ASC fluxes based upon these large runs, but also over different climate scenarios. And they essentially identified that, not surprisingly, that dissolved inorganic carbon was a strong predictor of the ASC exchange, but also alkalinity. And they also identified that the significance of those 2 parameters is changing through time, and therefore that the alkalinity controller is expected to increase. The significance of its ability to predict the flux is expected to increase with time. And this is particularly important because alkalinity is often poorly constrained within these particular models, but also because we know that biology modulates alkalinity. And we have observational evidence that shows that, for example, coccolithophores are moving poleward. These have the ability to change the alkalinity within the surface ocean. And in fact, previous work has identified that coccolithophores and the growth of them within the water column can reduce the flux and between the atmosphere and the ocean by up to 50% and even up to 155% in regions where these coccolithophores form. And they form predominantly in cold waters, so Arctic, Southern Ocean, for example. So these are also areas which are important for the oceanic sink of carbon. So clearly, biology has the potential of altering the chemical state of the water, which allows it to uptake the carbon dioxide through the physical processes. The second example here is a study which was focusing on the Southern Ocean. So here they used Argo floats. So these are autonomous floats collecting in situ data. I think they used something like 107 profiles. And here they wanted to try and identify and spit out all of the different components of the carbon cycle within the Southern Ocean. So they used it was essentially a tracer type approach, which allowed them to separate out what they considered to be the abiotic components, the physically driven component, versus that from biology. And they essentially identified that the organic carbon production enhances the uptake of carbon dioxide in the Southern Ocean, to the point where, if it wasn't for the biology, the Southern Ocean would actually be a small source rather than it's currently considered to be a large sink. And this was a combination of different biological processes which included organic carbon actually being the cause of the large amount of the sink, and then a small opposing direction was due to inorganic carbon. So again, linking back to these coccolithophores. So, but clearly, there's an example here of evidence that shows that biology is driving, is the reason behind the enabling this sink within the Southern Ocean. And then the last example is a piece of work that I was involved with. Here we were trying to use in situ observations from ships to reconstruct the annual and interannual sink within the Atlantic Ocean. And admittedly, with these results, typically, if you were doing this regionally or globally, the communities would focus on just describing and reconstructing these fluxes based on physics. And that makes a lot of sense because you start off simple. Why would you overcomplicate? So you start with the physics, and they do a reasonable job. But this particular studies showed that if you include ways in which we know biology can alter the surface water concentrations of gas, if we actually include that information within our reconstructions, not only do we start to see the spatial structures we expect to see, which were previously missing from these maps of uptake from the ocean, but it also has the result of altering the direction of the net flux. So in this case, it turned the area from being a small source from a small sink into a small source. So if we go back to our figure we had here at the beginning that I showed, essentially how, our question was, how is biology enabling or supporting this exchange and storage of carbon in our dissolved inorganic carbon, but also the exchange at the surface? And I've given 3 examples of pieces of work where it's looking at, it's changing and enabling and setting the conditions for the chemistry within the water, examples of deposition of carbon from the surface water to depth, but also ways in which the biology is altering the actual exchange at the surface itself. So for me, the question is, does or will the ocean biology enable continued uptake? How will this alkalinity change modulate the biologically driven or modulated alkalinity change with time? And how will this biological, organic and inorganic carbon deposition in the Southern Ocean, for example, the example I gave, alter through time? Will it be sustained? So clearly biological processes have led to the conditions under which contemporary exchange now occurs. Essentially those early cyanobacteria set up the conditions of which the current oceanic sink exists within and occurs. I've given examples of where biology appears important for regional uptake, and these regions are not isolated. They are interconnected, and the Southern Ocean is a large area of deep water formation, and all this carbon's been taken away. We can't just consider these regions to be isolated. And so, along with atmospheric forcing, ocean chemistry is really is going to be critical for how the future uptake changes. And this ocean chemistry can clearly be altered and modulated by biology, and I've given some examples of that. So for me, it would seem difficult to ignore the potential role of biology for altering current and future oceanic sink evolution.
Okay, so our audience is very shy today. Does nobody have a question, or is nobody prepared to express a perspective? Is there anybody out there who's bold enough to say that ocean biology is driving anthropogenic carbon uptake? But so Edgar, thanks for your question. So we've got a question in the chat for you, which is around organic alkalinity. I mean, that's a really interesting topic that we could run a whole webinar on. But have you got any thoughts on how organic alkalinity might be relevant to this, either of you?
Sorry, I can't actually see the questions in the chat. So can you?
So the question is, can biological processes produce organic matter that act in the acid-base system?
I think the answer is yes. I would not have an answer on how big the effect is. But it's been coming up again and again also in questions of consistency of carbonate system measurements. So I think the community is still exploring the size of this effect, but others in the audience might have more to say in this aspect.
I would agree with Judith on that one.
So I think from my perspective, organic alkalinity, a lot of people are talking about stuff coming down rivers. And of course, river DOC transport has changed a lot. So probably in the coastal zone, there's been some quite important effects. But I have seen some speculation that suggests that DOC fluxes down rivers are merely returning to what they were before human intervention in the form of acid rain. So that is a big and complicated, thorny question. So does anybody else have a question for? Excellent. So somebody else is. So Maria is asking how variations in ocean temperature and acidity affect biological processes. So as many of you will know, of course, the addition of CO2 to the surface ocean, as well as slowing the rate of climate change, is also causing ocean acidification. And that's something that many, many of us worry about. So how does that interplay between the benefits, perhaps, of anthropogenic carbon uptake and the downsides of ocean acidification play in your mind?
So I guess there's multiple aspects in this question as well. We've had a meta-analysis looking at interactive effects of temperature, nutrients, acidification on phytoplankton growth. And what we found is that actually both warming and PCO2 increase would have positive effects on phytoplankton growth, of course, only until a certain optimum in pH is reached, and there would be negative effect afterwards. But the interplay of the two would be that PCO2 increase would actually dampen the otherwise positive effects of warming. Yes, that's what we found there. I think none of this is sufficiently included in the current state of the Earth system models. But I would also think that the majority of this effect we would see in, all the other reasons we have to study ocean biology. So what does it mean for primary production? What does it mean for ecosystems? What does it mean for food webs? But probably to a lesser extent to ocean carbon uptake.
So we've got loads of questions coming in. So Jamie, I'll chuck one at you. Biogeography, coccolithophores, migrations. If biology is not operating at a steady state, then could that affect the driving force of ocean carbon uptake?
So yeah, this poleward movement that's been observed. When I say poleward movement, they're moving from mid latitudes closer to the pole, and it has been documented. It was theorized that they were moving, and then more recently we've seen evidence that they have been observed to move. And they can, through their growth, they take up carbon dioxide, but they also push it back out into the water. And so they have the impact of reducing the amount of carbon uptake that the water can achieve. And they also can, there's current work also that shows that they raise the temperature as well, which obviously is linked through solubility, also means that they alter the amount of carbon that can be uptake. So yes, and certainly some of my early work showed that it can be up to 155% reduction in the oceanic sink, depending on where they occur, when they occur. So they can have a significant impact. And it is something that there's a large project that's being run out of the UK, I think by Alex Bolton, who's actually online today. His study is looking at these impacts and influences, how strong can they be? And this is I think for me, this is a big area where they can alter the alkalinity. And so it links back to what I was talking about, the fact that if alkalinity is going to become more important for governing the uptake of carbon, and then we have biology that's influencing and changing that alkalinity quite significantly, then clearly the biology is having some role in controlling the sink, particularly in a region where you have a strong, strong oceanic sink is occurring.
I think we do have an alkalinity themed webinar later in our webinar series. So here's another question. You get one each there now. Is it possible to use macroalgae farming as a pollution treatment to minimize the effects? I mean, that's a big topical issue these days. What's your thinking about that, Judith?
Well, in terms of global ocean primary production, I think plankton is the major player, and macroalgae only contribute a very small part. So I would be kind of skeptic that we can upscale any macroalgae production to a level that it can really compensate anthropogenic CO2 emissions. But also that is an active area of research, and I think there are very different views out there in the community on that question.
Of course, macroalgae need nutrients as well, and if you put a nutrient in some macroalgae, then what's the poor phytoplankton going to be using?
Yeah.
So one more question, I suspect, perhaps two. A speaker called Alex P has contributed a question about fish. So fish have, it's pretty well documented that fishing has changed fish biomass quite extensively, and also we know that fish do an awful lot of quite interesting calcium carbonate relevant processes to maintain their internal osmotic pressure, and there's a lot of complicated physiology around that. So what's your thought about fish? Is that something that we need to think about, Jamie, or?
So I first of all, I was going to give an additional piece of information to the previous question about the macroalgae, and then I'll come on to the fish thing. So there has been experiments where they've been growing algae kelp alongside mussels, for example, because they can see that it's altering the localized carbonate system to the benefit of the mussel growth. And so quite often, increasingly, we're seeing macroalgae being farmed alongside mussels for that reason. But I think we need to put it into the scope, the broad scale. These are still very small regions, and it's very modulating the regional conditions, whereas we're talking about a much larger ocean. In terms of fishing, this is also quite a topical area at the moment. There's been a couple of papers that have come out recently. One in Frontiers in Marine Science, I think it was about a month ago, looking at with Gavin Schmidt as one of the co-authors on that, and they were talking about the impact of fishing and how it can increase or decrease the oceanic sink, and they identified that it could have a significant impact of up to about 15 or 20%, I think, of the sink. Whereas some work prior to that is saying it was much larger. But clearly, it's not just the removal of the fish, it's about the resuspension of everything in the benthic environment, and whether that remineralizes and how much you change the chemistry. Again, the influence you have within the water column that trawling impact is going to be having, that the activity of the fishing itself is currently unknown. And there are two large projects that are currently looking at that. One which is an insurance company funded, one called Convex Blue Carbon, and another one which is focused and funded by the European Union. And both of those are trying to address different aspects of that question.
Judith, do you have any views on fish?
Not too much, other than saying I think we're really still doing kind of poor in understanding the alkalinity cycle, and you said there would be another webinar coming up on that. The first aspects I would consider when doing work on alkalinity would be would be upper ocean calcium carbonate dissolution, which we have hardly a handle on why this is happening, though we know from geochemical observations that it has to happen, right? And all the role of aragonite, high magnesium calcite, etc. I think that would be where I would start looking if I wanted to understand the alkalinity better.
So, Alex, that's been a really good plug for your what I think you might be talking about in a future seminar. That's, of course, assuming that Alex P is Alex Fulton. So, yes, I mean, a brief anecdote is that I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that some of the earliest accounts of ocean observation were talking about large calcium carbonate plates covering the floor of the North Sea. I think we have really interfered a lot in the ocean calcium carbonate cycle, because that's just, not what the North Sea looks like these days. So have we got any further questions, or should we move on to wrapping up? Is anybody in the audience prepared to express a view on whether biology has a role in anthropogenic carbon uptake? No, perhaps you're all undecided or too polite to express a view. So thanks very much for coming. Do we have the final slide, please? Or perhaps the previous slide. That's the one. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to close the seminar now. I'd like to thank both our speakers for coming. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions, and I'd like to encourage you to come again. And this is a short kind of advertisement for what OceanICU is all about. What OceanICU is trying to get to grips with is, are human effects on ocean carbon cycling, not the anthropogenic carbon uptake, but the things that we do in the ocean, the resources we extract, the ways that we use the ocean space, are they now operating at the scale where we need to kind of consider those as important controls over the ocean carbon cycle? And that's got two parts to it, that question. The first is, what effects do these interventions that we do, what effects do they have on the ocean carbon cycle? And the second is, how intensive are these interventions? So, and that's really not just a science question. That's a question around what's the future trajectory of our exploitation of the ocean? So if you're working in an environment where that's something that troubles you too, or you have some insights into how ocean industry is like to evolve going forward, we'd love to talk to you. Because I mean, ultimately, it's that kind of drive that is it's that drive that's kind of driving us to go deeper into the ocean with potentially larger effects. And of course, there's a potential tension between the beneficial or the effects of ocean carbon cycling for us, tensioned against the sort of economic consequences and the economic benefits that we derive from using the ocean. And OceanICU is kind of exploring that space to try and find out what sort of solutions and strategies we might bring to the table. So if you're working in that space, we'd love to talk to you. And there's a QR code on the screen now that you can look at. So with that, we'll close it. And thanks very much for coming. And it's been great to see you. And please consider coming to the next one.